And we're on the air. All right. So, welcome everyone. Welcome to this PBR podcast. We're doing a special today with our panel of professionals to answer all of your questions about PBR, about physically based rendering. We're taking questions from the audience which is watching live. We're also answering questions from the user submitted questions that have been submitted to us through our Polycount thread throughout our episode leading up to this. So let me introduce everyone here. Andy Davis is better known as Metalliandy on the internet. He works on Knald and at Eat3D. Hi, Andy.
Hey.
So we're also joined by Joe Wilson. Hey, Joe.
Hey.
So Joe works at Marmoset. He makes the awesome presentational art and occasionally writes inspiring articles about PBR and other things. We're also joined by Lee Devonald. Hey, Lee.
Hello.
So Lee also works at Marmoset, so we have a very big representation of Marmoset today. Of course, these guys know PBR, so that's a very good thing. So we are also joined, last but not least, by Mark Sneddon. Hi, Mark.
Hello.
So Mark works at Creative Assembly, so those guys definitely know what they're doing, and we know that we're going to get some good answers from him. So my name is Mattias Van Camp. I will be your host today. I will be moderating this episode, which means that I'll be steering the topic of conversation and firing off questions at our panel of professionals. I won't be answering any questions myself. So all of the questions that we have listed here will be answered by our panel of professionals. So without any further ado, let's get started. PBR, physically based rendering. What is it, guys?
I have no idea.
Yeah, why'd you ask us on this, man?
Do you want me to start? I'll start.
Yeah.
So PBR, in just like the very most basic sense, is it's kind of two things. One of the things is more advanced and accurate shaders that represent real-world lighting better than previous shaders have. And then the second thing is really kind of standardized and calibrated art content that works specifically for the PBR pipeline. And this all works together to give a really cohesive and accurate look, kind of no matter what the lighting is in games, which can be an issue if you're just kind of eyeballing your art content and things like that.
All right. So yeah, it's a pretty general overview. So it seems like the most confusion around PBR exists around the workflow. So before we actually start getting into questions that might already be answered by giving a general overview, what is the biggest change in workflow when working with PBR as compared to the legacy workflow where you have to create glossiness and specular maps?
I think probably the biggest change is trying to bear in mind energy conservation and the way that affects how you author your content. Whereas before you would, for certain metallic substances, you might have to have had a base diffuse color and then had a tinted specular, and they kind of mix together to create this this overall appearance that's quite nice. That doesn't really work with the physically based workflow because it's not energy conservant. You're kind of adding more energy than is required from your light source to give you your final result. So that's probably the biggest change.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that we don't, but well, from an artist's point of view, we don't really bake ambient occlusion, and we use the albedo is a lot different to diffuse as well.
Oh yeah. So what is the biggest difference between legacy diffuse and the new albedo?
Well, I mean, because albedo values are like generally. Well, a lot of the time they're totally different to what you'd expect. Like the color of something, would probably be a lot darker. I mean, what was the value, Lee? Was it 0.04? Is it an average value?
Oh no, that's your reflectance.
Right. But yes, I mean, and you don't have ambient occlusion baked in like you did in the last gen either. So, but you can generally put it into like another slot in the shader, so you can still get ambient occlusion in it.
Yeah, I think if you're looking in terms of baked lighting, the biggest difference in albedo. Between albedo and like your old diffuse is the whole idea is that with physically based lighting, your content can work with any lighting situation. And if you're pre-baking in lighting information like cavity or ambient occlusion, and then multiplying that down into your diffuse, and then that's going out into your final asset, what you'll find is that that only works in very specific lighting instances, and you'll find that there might be a highlight that belongs somewhere on your model that just doesn't look right because you've got this shading already baked in.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's much more so than it was in like last gen.
Yeah, essentially the shaders are just doing more of the lighting work, which is a good thing.
It just leads to a more consistent shading, I suppose.
There's also when you talk about albedo and versus diffuse, it depends on your workflow. So if you're working with like the metalness maps, your albedo is actually both your diffuse map and your specular map in a sense, because for metalness, for objects that are metallic, you flag that as white in the metalness map, and then it pulls the diffuse color or the albedo color for the specular color and intensity. Which, yeah,
that's a really good point, actually. Yeah, so it all depends on your workflow.
Yes.
Yeah, so the biggest difference seems to be between the PBR and the legacy is the fact that you can now just set up your scene with correct lights and trust that your stuff will look good if you have proper material definition in your shaders.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So,
I mean, like one of the big things about PBR is just like deep coupling everything from being all baked into a texture, so that when you put all of the individual components back together in any possible combination, like they're always going to look like they should do.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So also, it's interesting to see what is going on behind the scenes. So one of the bigger things about PBR that we've seen a lot of talk about that hasn't really been elaborated on, and that a lot of people seem to be confused by, is the rule with energy conservation. Now, it's pretty straightforward in itself, but it might be good to elaborate on that a bit.
Okay.
Yeah. So
who wants to take it?
I'll take it. So the basic concept of energy conservation is that an object or a material cannot reflect more light than hits it. And if you eyeball your materials, and you can really easily get this by, say, your specular intensity is like 0.7 and your diffuse intensity is 0.5, you're at 1.3 or whatever, which is 1.3 times the amount of light that hits an object would be reflecting, which is just physically completely inaccurate.
Yeah,
so this applies to both the reflectivity or specularity or whatever you want to call it, and also the gloss or roughness as well. So when you have a rougher surface, the same amount of light hits it, but it gets dispersed over a wider area. So the highlight becomes both dimmer and broader. So, and that's one of the reasons that you can kind of drop an explicit specular intensity map, because with energy conservation in the gloss or roughness pass, you can vary the intensity along with the size of the highlight at the same time. So.
Yeah, I think that's why the metalness workflow has become so popular, is because so many non-metallic materials share a very similar range of reflective values. So yeah, they're not all exactly at the 0.04% reflectivity that the metalness workflow uses, but they're within such a small range of that value that it's considered to be okay to use. And because of the way roughness works, when, as Joe said, when your surface becomes rougher, it appears dimmer. That's not because it's any less reflective. The surface is still as reflective as it was when it was perfectly smooth. The reason it looks dimmer is because when the light hits the surface, the light is being scattered in so many different directions that less light actually scatters back towards your eye, which is why it appears dimmer. The rest of the light just scatters off in all kinds of different directions.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's a phenomenon that you can actually very easily duplicate in real life, where you have wet rocks, for example. Dry rocks will appear very bright, but with they don't have any reflections to them at all. Where wet rocks will have reflections, but dark diffuse, or will seem to have a dark diffuse, is kind of the same phenomenon going on there, or at least that's what I read in Other Worlds, which is a painting book by I forgot the name of the author. I will.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I will
that's
post that in
essentially
the
true
section.
because
Yeah,
the
that's
water
true.
is acting like it's like coating the object and making it more smooth. So
Yeah, exactly. So about that roughness thing, roughness is the new kind of glossiness, but it's something a little bit different. So what is the thing there?
It's the same. It's exactly the same. People kind of
The-
don't
the-
understand.
yeah.
Roughness is exactly the same as glossiness is, and in fact, there's a lot of people who actually just invert their their lookup. So they, instead of making their roughness map where the bright colors in their texture are rough, you just flip it, and then the bright colors are glossy and the dark colors are rough, the same as they were before. It's exactly the same.
Yes.
Yeah, so
So that's a very confusing thing that was going on there, and it seems like a lot of confusion was just around the fact that it's a different term, but it's not different at all.
Yeah, I
it's
think
just a
the reason for the difference in terms is very simply, I think, unconsciously, when the industry made this shift over to physically based rendering, they kind of wanted to, in a way, detach it as far as possible from the old way of doing things. So they introduced these new terms, and it works well enough to a point, because you kind of think albedo physically based, roughness physically based, reflectance physically based, but they still mean the same things as diffuse, gloss, and specular. It's just that they've changed the terminology so people think about them differently, but actually you can simplify it right down and say, they're the same things. Don't worry about it. What you just need to worry about is the content itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like basically the only real difference is just, like I said, it's been inverted. So as before, you'd have a 1.0 would be fully, a white would be fully glossy, and now it's just fully rough. So it's literally just inverted, yeah.
and this can depend on your specific workflow too. You might have a studio that has what they call a gloss map that has an inverted scale, and it's really just how you map the values, and pretty much nothing more.
Yeah. I mean,
you get a little more technical with it as in terms of like your specific BRDFs. Like if you have GGX or Blendfong, then the roughness curve can be a little different. But for most people, like you don't really need to worry about that.
Yeah, I suppose if anything, it's just the games seem to be just moving over to a more filmic workflow, because they've had like albedo and all this sort of stuff in films for years, haven't they?
Yeah, I mean, that's where physically based came from, and that's I'm pretty sure that's actually why roughness is kind of referred to as roughness, is because the talk that Disney did at SIGGRAPH about their physically based shading model years and years back, they happened to use roughness for as the descriptor for that term in their workflow, and it's just sort of carried over to games.
Yeah, a lot of it I think is just like coders are trying to mess with artists, like put them through hell, and they're just like these dollars are going down.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That Disney paper, I think that Epic, a lot of their shaders and things are kind of based off that Disney paper.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Actually, Lee right now is implementing GGX in Toolbag. Do you want to talk about that a little?
If I must. Yeah, no, it's it was just something quite a few people requested it for Toolbag, to kind of bring Toolbag to the point where you could preview things quickly and easily, and then shift over to the Unreal Engine. And up until now, that was kind of difficult to do, because Blendfong works very, very differently from the way the GGX standard does. So you have a very different kind of curve on your roughness or your gloss. So we've kind of worked hard and studied up on some of the source material, and basically just tried to get Toolbag to match as close as possible to the Unreal standard. But at the same time, we're still keeping all of the previous things that we had, and making sure that as an artist you have the choice of do you want to work with Blendfong, which is still used by many studios, or do you want to preview with GGX so that you're ready for the Unreal Engine? Because the Unreal Engine is an absolutely fantastic tool. Mark and I were talking about it today. How easy it is and how fast it is to. I think Mark was saying he managed to get like a prototype going within an hour, which is incredible. But at the same time, in terms of previewing art content, it can sometimes be a lot more hassle to import everything that you want into the Unreal Engine and get it all set up with the material editor and everything. Whereas, the idea with Toolbag is that we just kind of get it in quick, fast, accurate, and you can go from there.
Right. So because you can be sure that your display will be very high in its fidelity, you know that if we can trust this algorithm, then we can work from there and trust that we have a very solid basis to work on, and then take things from there, and then make sure that we can display everything very correctly. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, I have a question from sorry Joe. I have a question from the audience here on YouTube. So the question is: isn't regular rendering a subset of PBR? So I think that means isn't legacy rendering a subset of PBR?
So basically, yeah. I mean, every renderer basically in the history of computer rendering has attempted to be physically accurate. This isn't really a new thing in that sense. Mm-hmm. We just have faster computers, and we can do more accurate math in real time than we could in the past. I think is really the biggest difference. But yeah, pretty much that's true.
Right. So then I guess it's time to move on to some of the more specific questions that have been submitted to us by our audience on Polycount. So one of the more interesting questions that I actually saw was how are values actually measured? Because we see a lot of papers saying the values that we are seeing in PBR for a lot of different kinds of materials have been measured from real-world materials. So one of the biggest questions seems to be, how do these measurements get made? Does anybody want to take that?
So I'll take it. No one else says. Okay. So it's a really complicated answer.
Yeah.
The basic thing is that really your average artist shouldn't be worrying about measuring values. Like right. It's not a feasible thing. I mean, if you really know what you're doing and really understand how it works, you can build your own scanner. And what it basically consists of is a high quality camera and polarizers that filter light in very specific ways. And yeah, so like you can.
I can tell you how to make a ghetto version of that very, very cheaply, very quickly, very easily. I'll go into that in a minute.
And yeah, Radiance Forge. What is Chris Parnell has done a kind of little do-it-yourself project too. If you guys are interested in scanning, you can check out his site. And I mean, that's what the Quixel guys do too. They have a box that is just like, they can scan like a 3x3 meter area, and it's a box filled with DSLRs and like a bunch of LED lights, so they can toggle them on and off to capture different lighting conditions, and then they do a bunch of math to put that all together and spit out the various scan values. So
right.
There's also like industrial things that you can get, but like this isn't really something your average artist would need to do. Generally, on site, you would have like a library of these sort of materials, hopefully, and you as a studio, you might want to invest in scanning technology. But I think as things like Megascans, when it releases, and services like that provide scan data will be really important and kind of huge and very useful to people. Just so that,
Yeah, like finding like correctly mapped ranges of values for reflectivity for real world materials. If you look online, you can find a lot of materials for that. But I can tell you from my own personal experience, it's a complete and utter minefield trying to get stuff that actually works in a correct manner. So unless you really absolutely have to do it yourself, I'd really recommend just not worrying about it.
Yeah, I think that from an artist point of view, the things that you should be looking for are things like the don't nod chart. The guys
from Remember Me
that worked on Remember Me. They put out the chart of like various reflective values for different materials in RGB format, and that's kind of like, as an artist, that's probably about as technical as you need to go. Find one of those charts and use that as a guideline for the kind of thing that you're looking at.
I think one of the main problems with that chart, I mean, it's a cool chart and it's great for a reference, but unless the engine's hooked up to it, then the values would be wrong. So people have to use caution when they're mapping values directly from it?
I don't know. I think the values are reasonably close enough that you can kind of get away with it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is, if you've got like, how many different specular types are there in PBR currently? You've got GGX and you've got like Blimfong and all that stuff, right?
Yeah. Pretty much everybody is using GGX though, from what I've seen. I mean, it's kind of like GGX is kind of emerged as the kind of de facto standard model from from what I've seen.
Yeah, I think that'll probably be the case. Another thing that I think is kind of important to mention is that scan content and scan values really should be used as more of like a base, not an absolute rule, and that like they don't override basic art skills. Like a lot of people think that you can just plug in scan values and then you're done, but a lot of the times you won't be able to find the exact scan value for the material that you need, so you're going to want to try to find something similar and kind of extrapolate and experiment until you find what you need. And then even if you do find a specific scanned material, the actual values, especially for like roughness, are going to vary a huge amount on the age, wear, oxidization, all sorts of things like that. And like a lot of scan values from material libraries that are like from laboratory conditions of pure metals and things like that you don't really see very often in real life. So you have to kind of keep all of that in mind, and that you still need to use artistic skills and taste to determine the final result.
Yeah, it's also a bit of common sense, it's right. Kind of you kind of look at these reflective libraries and you go, okay, so here's one for like the purest of golds. Okay, that's fine. If you're making like a little gold ring, that probably works very well. Put a couple of smudge marks into the roughness map and you're done. But when it comes to things like I don't know, like a knight in armor that's started getting tarnished and it's got like rust spots and stuff like that, that's when you start mixing materials. And I think it's one of those things where having the guideline there is really important, because you don't want to eyeball too much, because that then breaks the whole physically based thing. But you also kind of want to take that base material and just tweak it slightly and go, okay, so if it's become oxidized, then that means that it's less metallic. So put slightly less metal into the metalness mask. Put a little bit of coloration into there that sort of takes it away from that silver color and brings it into that rust color. But you've still got that underlying material that you can trust is correct. Yeah.
So I'm actually glad you brought that metalness mask up, because there is also a question that I've seen happen quite a lot, is what exactly is the correct approach to metalness? Because there is the paper by Epic Games that was released not too long ago that said that metalness is supposed to be a zero, either 0 or 1, and can be masked, of course, but it should be either 0 or 1. And then other people are saying that metalness can be gray shade variants. So does anybody care to elaborate on that?
I mean, if you've got a transition from metal to a non-metal, then it seems perfectly reasonable to me that you can have a gradient to that.
Right.
So like if you've got like, I suppose like a really heavy rust, it's not really metal, right? But
I mean, if your surface is just mostly metal though, with nothing really on top of it, like you pretty much would want that to be just solid, white like metal for the most part.
Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I don't know. I mean, if you've got the transition going through, then if you can use it, it doesn't cost you any extra. Then, unless you use some like binary values.
Well, that's the thing. For the majority of materials, like you can kind of say, in terms of ease of use, you can kind of say, yeah, it's binary. Something is either metal or it's not metal. There are very few materials in the real world that are considered semi-metals. I think there's like 8. In the entire world that are semi-metallic.
Most of the crystals as well.
Yeah, it's. But when it comes to layering your materials and things like that, well, yeah, it kind of makes sense that you'd go for a couple of grayscale values, because rust is, we'll take rust as a classic example. It's a progressive thing that happens over time to metal. The surface can be more rusty in some areas and less rusty in others. So you'd expect it to become less metallic over time. You'd expect that you'd expect that value to go from white down to black as a gradient. It just makes sense, you know.
Yeah, but also, you know, if you had like just a metal surface with, you know, some kind of soil, like, you know, just brushed over the top of it, you wouldn't want to have just a 0 or 1 metalness mask, because you're just going to introduce aliasing when you try and render that. So you kind of, it makes sense to have some kind of gradient between the 1 and 0 in there.
Yeah.
So having some kind of smudging along the edges.
Right.
Yeah. That's kind of that's again where your artistic sense of, you know, common sense kicks in, because you can kind of look at the finished result and go, this doesn't quite look right, maybe I need to just adjust values slightly.
Right.
So,
I think Joe wanted to say something as
Oh,
well.
I was just going to say, usually you're going to use a 1 or 0 value, but like transition areas are, you know, just the most common place where you'd want to get into those gray values.
All right, yeah. So I'm kind of looking into the questions that we still have hanging around here. There's actually an interesting question that might be applicable to a production situation. Is someone said here that they'd be interested to hear about the pros and cons of switching to PBR from a production side. So that's actually an interesting question.
Basically, everything is easier and better, and you have to rework less work, I think is the simplest way of putting it.
I guess that's an obvious answer then.
I think the big challenge there would be doing it mid-project.
Converting stuff, man.
Right, so you might have to convert a lot of your content. You wouldn't really have to redo it entirely, but you might need to go back and rework a lot of the textures. But
yeah, I mean, it's not something I'd recommend, like, you know, halfway through a project.
Right.
You know, it's like start off a new project with it, but then, you know,
that would be kind of a lot of work.
This is something I can speak about personally, actually, because this is actually what we did partway through developing Alien Isolation, and kind of partway through the project, we decided to swap to the physically based model, which we didn't have before, and we had pretty much like one programmer doing all of the code work, and we had an artist working on it, like a senior artist who knew loads about it, and he left, you know, and I had to pick up the you know, the work there, and I cannot explain how painful it was, because I had to sort of go through the process of learning how physically based shading works. At the same time, it was trying to set up guidelines and convert all the content we already had over to the new system, and I really could not recommend doing that mid-project. But once it was done, the difference was just immediate. It was so obvious. Like, it was such a brilliant move, because what you're doing in a lot of cases is you're kind of tweaking things per situation, right? You have like a specific thing that you're trying to, you know, polish up and make look a bit nicer. And if you do that with something that's like a global kind of material definition, it's really easy to just break it. Whereas if you know you've set it up using a physically based system, using the correct values in the material and shader and the textures that are input into it, you know that it's going to be correct, right? Because you have like one test case where it works correctly, and because physically based is what it is, if it works in one place, it in theory works correctly everywhere. So it's really easy if you have a situation where something doesn't look like it should do, and you kind of have someone come over and say, hey, you know, like, there's this thing, this material, it doesn't look like it should do. And it's very easy to just turn around and say, well, yeah, but it's physically based, right? It's correct. I'll show you a test. It looks right here. And, you know, you can go and look at, you know, your lighting setup and all these other different contributing factors, and it's very likely one of those.
Yeah, I suppose it takes away like all of the variables, you know, because whereas before a lot of art was all based on the artist's eye, you know what I mean? So like, you know, that they could make spec look really good because they slaved away in Photoshop for, you know, 20 hours on a texture or something. Whereas now, like, you know, they're still slaving away, but it's only for like 5 hours or something, you know.
It was very dependent on like the preview lighting that an artist was creating a material for. So like if an artist is making his texture content in a preview level with a very specific set of lighting, like he's adjusting and tweaking all these values in his spec map and the color to look good in that lighting environment, and that's just a really kind of backwards way to do it. You want it to look good in every lighting environment, so you want to have like a really neutral lighting environment, and instead of tweaking the values to look good specifically in one place, you really want to check in multiple areas, multiple lighting conditions, and all these other things. Because what you end up doing is as an artist, you make changes to your content when you should really be making changes to your lighting. So.
Yeah, cool.
That's actually a very interesting question. I'm going to bring this up on the podcast itself, actually. So one question that was asked is how to convert linear values into sRGB values. That's actually you can find that on Wikipedia. Mark, you said it was you could find on Wikipedia. So is there like a very short summary that you can give, or you just say, yeah, go to Wikipedia and look it up?
Yeah, the best option is going to be to go to Wikipedia and look it up, to be honest.
Do math.
like as an artist, it's kind of rare you're going to need to do that, really. Like, that's not really the kind of thing you'd be responsible for dealing with, ever.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but for the sake of argument, I created a spreadsheet a while ago. I can't actually paste links into the YouTube.
I'll add the link to the spreadsheet in the description after we're done.
Yeah, it shouldn't be editable by anyone, so you'll just need to copy and paste the formulas into Excel, and you're good to go.
Yep.
Yeah. Jeff Russell, one of our engineers, our lead engineer on Toolbeck, actually made a little math equation that I can link to at some point too. It's just really easy.
Yeah, it would be cool. Yeah, I'm just looking through the other questions that we have here. Seems like most of them have been answered for the most part. It seems like some confusion still exists about the rendering overhead. So that might actually be a good thing to elaborate upon, is how much, is there a gain in performance, or are we just relying on increasing computing power to do all the math involved with this?
So, from my point of view, it is more performance heavy in terms of the math that's used, in the actual shaders and in the rendering. In terms of like your texture allocations, when you start looking at things like your metalness workflow, that's where you can actually save, because you're only using, you only need to use your albedo for all of your color. Whether it's your specular color or your diffuse color, you use your albedo map for all of that, and then you just use a mask to control what's reflective and what's not. So from that respect, you can actually make quite a big saving over having a full-on RGB diffuse map and a full-on RGB specular map. But in terms of the actual shader code, yes, it's more expensive, but it's actually not that much more expensive. I think there were a couple of games.
New hardware.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a couple of games in last gen that were, at the very least, using the point light BRDFs that we're seeing now. The biggest difference now is real-time image-based lighting, and spherical harmonics and stuff are coming into play a lot more prominently, because the hardware can kind of handle it, whereas before it was just the point light contribution that could be handled.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of the additional cost of going to a physically based system is like the supporting technology that kind of sits around it, and really relies on PBR being there. I mean, stuff like screen space reflections, for one, is a system which directly relies on you having physically based materials and shaders set up correctly, but it's a cost you maybe wouldn't have had before.
Right.
Yeah, I think in most PBR systems you'll have a few passes for reflection, and the first pass being your ambient cube map reflections, which you'll either take from like Skybox cube map, or you'll bake from the actual level content itself, and then you'll have screen space reflections that apply on top of that to take care of things that wouldn't be in that reflection map content, usually like self-reflection on objects and reflecting dynamic objects and things like that, and all of that can get kind of significantly more expensive than what you would see on like a last generation console, for instance.
Right. So it seems like depending on the approach, you may have less textures that you need to load in, but there's more shader calculations that need to happen.
Yeah, that's pretty fair. I mean, I don't think even the texture cost is really that much diminished. I mean, you could maybe, it depends what you're using before, really.
Yeah.
Right.
Full color specular maps, you're probably going to save quite a lot, but you're still using a lot of the same stuff. You're still going to be using a norm map, you're still going to be using RGB albedo, so the cost overall, like the total cost of all of your textures, is not really going to be reduced very much.
I guess because also you've got like cavity and ambient occlusion maps as well. least with some shaders, like it's separate single channel textures.
Yeah, I think it
Didn't have.
depends really specifically if you had grayscale spec or if you had full color spec. If you had full color spec, then you can pack basically a metalness mat, a gloss or roughness mask, and AO or cavity mask into the same space that you use just for that full color specular. If you had grayscale spec, you can kind of pack it in the same way that you did before, so there's not really much difference then.
And plus, like with compression and stuff now, with the DX11 cards, you've got like BC7, BC6H, 11, 11, 10, which are like much more advanced, compression format. Whereas, well, just generally just a lot better than DXT.
Yeah, I mean, if you are using older hardware though, and you're still using DXT's compressor textures, if you are packing multiple discrete images into single texture files, you're still going to get some amount of compression artifacting. But to be honest, for the efficiency that you're getting, it's probably kind of worth it.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's definitely worth moving over to to PBR, I think, for sure.
Yeah, so but it's most of the time saving seems to happen on the texture creation or the authoring front, where you have to spend less time on iteration and you can spend more time on actually making things look right.
There's less text work now.
I would say that probably one of the biggest things from an artist point of view that's really good about using PBR is that there are a lot less input factors that you have to worry about. So whereas before you might have had to input all of your textures and then set up a whole different bunch of variables in your shader as well to get everything to look just right, like now the shader does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So by having a lot less actual inputs into the shader, you kind of improve your consistency and reduce the work that you have to do to get the same result.
Yeah, like things like Fresnel should pretty much be handled automatically by the shader now. And usually you're just going to want to lock all your values in your shader to specific values, and then control everything with the art content, which means that the art content is more reusable than it was before. If you had like one model and every model had its own little shader tweaks on it to look good for whatever reason, so you can really enhance your consistency that way.
I think the other thing as well is because things are kind of they're all based on reflectance values now, and as we said before, the reflectance of an object doesn't really change regardless of how smooth or how rough the object is. That's another kind of big time saver for you. You can kind of like if you are authoring a full color specular map, you could just get away with full block values for specific areas of your texture. You wouldn't have to you could basically make an entire material one reflectance value rather than having to worry about making this bit brighter here or this bit less bright, or painting in stippling and things like that. That just doesn't need to happen anymore, because before you would do that because you wanted to make things look more or less reflective, but you don't need to do that now because the entire surface has the same reflective value. So the majority of your effort just needs to go into the roughness or gloss map.
Yeah, I think previously artists spent a lot of time basically manually authoring what is just energy conservation into their spec map because the shader didn't do it for them. So yeah, like Lee says, a lot of times you can get away with very simple values for the specular content. And I just want to touch on one other thing here that a lot of people look at like the metalness workflow as like being specific to PBR, but metalness, full color, specular, if you're using physically accurate shaders, both are pretty much equivalent inputs. It's just a matter of like just some trade-offs. Like for the metalness thing, you get less accuracy, but it's more efficient, and it might be faster for artists to use. Whereas like a full color spec, you get more control, but it takes more memory, and there's more kind of opportunities for artists to put in weird values, or like incorrect values. So it's kind of just pros and cons there.
I suppose that's also a massive change actually since the last gen. That gloss and spec, they're sort of like swapped around now in terms of how much detail you put in the textures. Because like before, like gloss was just one particular value, wasn't it? Well, per material obviously. Whereas now, like it seems the gloss maps are just spammed with like all the detail, as noisy as you can get it, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean the gloss map is pretty much now defining the actual surface, because as we said, the majority of non-metallic surfaces have very, very similar reflective properties. So the way you kind of define whether a surface is rubber or plastic, that's all in the roughness map, and if it is plastic, how scuffed is it, their fingerprints there, smudges, is there like a layer of oil over the top of it, that's all defined through the gloss map, because the reflectance value just doesn't change. This actually brings me on to a question that I saw on the forum as well from Mr. Hobo, Charles Metz. He asked, I feel like a lot of this can be sort of all over the place depending on the character. And this is down to skin rendering in PBR. There's some hard and fast rules for handling the specular and gloss for characters in PBR. What about subdermis maps, and how heavily should they be relied upon to bring the character to life? So when it comes to like the specular and gloss, reflectivity for skin is actually really, really low. A lot of the light is actually absorbed into the skin, or not absorbed, but it scatters through the skin. So the reflective value for skin is somewhere around 0.028. It's really, really low. It's lower than even the default non-metal if you're using the metalness workflow. But it's close enough that you can get away with the metalness workflow. I've just linked to Mattias again. Hopefully, he'll put that out there. It's like a small chart from a GDC conference that's used as kind of a rough guideline for the glossiness of different areas of a person's face. The reason I say a rough guideline is because everybody is different. Everyone has different oil compositions. Everyone has different complexions. These values are taken from, the average of a whole bunch of different people that they've photographed and scanned and taken these ranges from. So absolutely feel free to sort of diverge away from these values, but they're fairly close to what you kind of want in your roughness or gloss maps when it comes to authoring. They'll give you a fairly solid result. And as for the second part of that question as to whether how heavily relied upon subdermis maps are, that kind of depends from studio to studio and from the way things are implemented. Like, I know a lot of studios use what's called like a pre-integrated solution, so they won't actually use a subdermis map. That math is already pre-coded into the shader. They'll use lookup textures to kind of get all that information for them. With Toolbag, we do everything real time, so there's no pre-integration, there's no lookup textures. You need to supply that information yourself. So the end result is still the same. It's still very important for bringing character skin to life, because the subdermis map basically describes how far light scatters underneath the skin after you've factored in the reflection. So yeah, there you go.
Yeah. In general, I don't know if this is super accurate to say, but it seems like with skin shaders, and specifically with physically accurate lighting, it's kind of a mess. Like how accurate your lighting is once you do all these different, once you can take all these other considerations into specifically how skin is rendered and like energy conservation in skin, and it's like kind of difficult to ensure that that's still being rendered in a physically accurate sense. But so I guess in that sense, you probably just have to use your better judgment in a lot of cases when working with skin shaders and making sure that you're checking it in various lighting conditions and it still holds up.
Right. So actually, one question that I've been hearing around pretty much everywhere is how stylization is handled. Is like stylization that tends to be somewhat further away from physically correct values and materials. Would PBR still be a valid system to do that within, or would you say that it might be better to go back to the legacy system because stylization tends to be non-physically correct?
No. Absolutely, PBR is still completely valid for that.
Yeah.
If you have a metal, even if it's a stylized metal, you still want it to read as a metal, so it still has to have the same real-world reflectivity attributes that metal has.
I have a link for that.
What I guess a lot of people don't kind of realize so much is that this whole physically based rendering workflow, kind of this whole sort of bandwagon, it came from film VFX, right? It came from Pixar and Disney, and Pixar and Disney don't make realistic films. They make very stylized films, you know?
Yeah.
Like Up and Frozen were made with physically based rendering.
Actually, very interesting that I read earlier today is that the hair in Tangled was already physically shading.
You can actually see it as well when you've got when you've got a 2-year-old daughter. You end up watching a lot of Disney films, right? One of the things I've noticed recently is that the hair in Tangled looks phenomenal. It looks so much better than everything else in the scene, and that's because it's reacting to light in the proper way. And then when you look at, I think Wreck-It Ralph was their first movie that they went the whole hog, you know, absolutely everything physically based, and everything ties together so nicely, you know. All of their materials are well defined. All of the lighting is really good, but I think that the thing that you can take away from it the most is Wreck-It Ralph is a ridiculously stylized film that not only shows you know, super stylization in terms of anatomy and form when you look at characters like Ralph, but it also shows an incredible diversity in what it can handle. You look at the scene where they go into the you know, that like the alien invasion, you know, and everything seems to sort of switch from this, you know, really super colorful, extremely vibrant, over-the-top kind of aesthetic to this, you know, this grim, you know, super space marine kind of almost realistic view, you know. But everything still holds together really, really well, and it's because they're using a physically based system. They can define everything as being very particular in their materials, and they know that it will react exactly the same way to all the same lighting conditions.
Yeah, it's really interesting as well, because one of the things that I remember about them talking about Wreck-It Ralph was that they were explaining that once they'd moved, you know, they moved their entire rendering pipeline to physically based, and the knock-on effect of that is it reduced their time that they spent relighting on the film to basically nothing. They basically didn't have to redo any lighting for the entire project, because once they did it one time, it just always worked after that.
Wow.
I think that in general, it's kind of a narrow view to think of like stylization in games as just like hand-painted textures, right? To just like pigeonhole into that one thing, because stylization can come from all sorts of different aspects of the art pipeline, from lighting to like character design to the specific sculpting work that you put into the assets and the specific way everything is modeled, and you know, you get a lot of stylization from that. So yeah, I mean, PBR works great with stylized stuff. There's no question about that.
Right. Yeah, so I think then that we're through most of the questions that we have. If anyone has anything to add to what we've already discussed.
I think Charles has asked. It's kind of similar, but we'll take it anyway. It's about Toolbag and workflows and stuff.
Yes.
Saying in Toolbag, I like to preview specular and gloss with the sliders and then try and match them in the textures when I'm working. Is there any way to convert those sliders to RGB, or is that what we were talking about? Yes, it's kind of what we were talking about.
Yeah, pretty much.
The chart that I provided, I think Mattias is going to link afterwards.
Yes.
That will help you convert values from the linear format that's in Toolbag to the sRGB that you'd be working in Photoshop. If you want to just work in sRGB, at the moment you could look at if you just want to work in linear values, you could look at Substance Painter. Substance Painter works entirely in linear values, so you can kind of trust that all those values are the same there as you'll see in Toolbag. It's also, from my experience, super easy to work with. And then I think the new Dedus, or the new Quixel suite, works in linear as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and you can set Toolbag up to take linear as an input as well. It's just in the per texture options.
Yeah,
which all the values can be either or.
Yeah, you can set it to sRGB if you're working in sRGB, and it'll take those.
It's kind of funny you mentioned Painter actually, because this is something I was kind of interested in talking about. I don't think it's something we really covered or got any questions about already. But kind of looking at the more high-end workflows now and toolsets that are available for creating materials and textures, kind of like more for PBR, they look really exciting to me. I haven't managed to use very many of them really so far, but I mean, if you look at like Substance Designer and Substance Painter, it's kind of like integrating like procedural generation of PBR materials with like a really fast like 3D painter, and what Quixel are doing as well with their Quixel suite, with the having the Megascans library of presets of materials and being able to kind of all of these texturing workflows they're kind of leaning more towards working with materials and blending between materials rather than individual textures, which they kind of were before.
Yeah.
And I think that Quixel actually have on their technology roadmaps, they're working on the integration with Mari as well. So I think it's kind of interesting. I think it's kind of interesting that these kind of like high-end workflows, they're all kind of leaning towards some kind of procedural material generation as well as some kind of 3D painting solution for masks to blend between materials.
Yeah.
I think that's a really powerful workflow. I think that's something that's going to really take off over the next few years and become really prevalent across the whole game industry. I don't know if you guys wanted to talk about that at all.
Yeah.
Well, I think if I may pitch in here for a second, then I think Unreal Engine 4 and Epic themselves are actually kind of driving towards that kind of approach, because in most of their demos they haven't actually shown texturing or material creation with textures. Rather, they have shown one of their main features that they've shown throughout the lead up to Unreal Engine 4's launch was the ability to blend materials with masks. So I think they're driving more towards an approach where you just use masks to blend materials that are mostly defined by linear values or very, very basic masks, rather than the full texturing workflow, which I think is very much supported by the PBR system in itself, and the PBR, the entire frame that you're working within, because you're just blending materials, and that's how the real world works.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly it.
It's interesting, but like that approach to doing it, if that is solely your approach to shading a game, that is prohibitively expensive to be able to render that. Like, you're never going to be able to make an entire game like that because it's going to be too expensive to draw.
So there was actually a question on a different thread, like a day or two ago in Polycount, about exactly this, and basically the relationship between PBR and layering. And I wrote up a little response, but my basic answer to that was that layering in itself isn't specifically PBR. You can do layering without PBR. You can do PBR without layering. But it does seem to be kind of the way that a lot of art content is going to be created, and just kind of the general. And it makes a lot of sense that you deal with actual materials that are specific to a certain surface.
I can elaborate on the difference a little bit from my limited experience with Unreal 4 anyway. Is the way they generate their materials is that they have very small textures, like 256s, and they tile them across your entire material, and so that kind of gives the illusion that you have like this really nice big material, but actually it's just a really small tiled texture. Where it becomes expensive is when you start to layer 6, 7, 8 of these things on top of each other. You have to render every single one of those materials, and the more materials that the more materials that you layer on top of each other, the more and more expensive it becomes. The difference between that and things like the Quixel suite and with Substance Designer and Substance Painter is that they render out one texture that is built from, the Quixel suite uses scan data that they then convert into a tileable format that then tiles across your entire mesh, and that's absolutely fantastic. But the key there is that it doesn't export it as a tiled texture. It exports it as a texture that fits your UV map, and that's it. You're done. You just have the one texture. You're not actually exporting 7, 8, 9, 10 different layered textures that then have to be relayered inside Unreal. You're just exporting one texture that has everything blended together the way that you want it to be, and that's it. You're done. the same thing is true of Substance Designer and Substance Painter. And, you know, as Mark said, Substance Painter is really kind of exciting because you're painting in 3D, but you're not painting... I mean, you can paint individual channels if you want to, but the cool thing about it is you're painting an actual material. You go, right, I want, you know, scuffed leather here. So you paint scuffed leather, and it paints for you the albedo, it paints the metalness value, it paints the roughness value for you as well. And then if you wanted to switch to a different part of the model and paint, you know, rusted iron, you do exactly the same thing, and it paints the actual material where you want it to be. And then when you export, it just exports the map that you want. It doesn't export, you know, 10 different layers. It just exports the one final map. So it's way cheaper in terms of performance to do it that way. But I can see why, at the very least for prototyping, you know, layering all these different materials in Unreal is going to be very good.
I think it's really, a trade-off, really.
I think it's really interesting how what is it? The Order does it, because they have a layering system similar.
That's exactly what I was going to talk about.
Oh yeah. So they have a layering system similar to Unreal, but they actually pre-bake everything down to individual textures, and I think that, from terms of performance, it makes a lot more sense. And I don't know how feasible it is to use real-time layered shaders like Unreal allows you to do for like a whole game. I don't know if that's really very feasible.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I was going to talk about quickly. Is that Ready at Dawn with the Order, they actually support both methods, right? So if you purely are, as with anything in this kind of area, what you're talking about between the two different methods is essentially a trade-off. On using one method, you're going to have really high texture, you know, usage, but you're going to be cheap to draw. And on the other hand, you're going to have really low texture usage, but really expensive to draw. So you kind of always have to balance that out. But using like an offline solution where you kind of you bake all of your parameters down into one texture, you know, that's really useful. And that's kind of what Quixel and Substance are going for. And that's what Ready at Dawn are doing on the Order with their offline baking tool. And that's really great, you know, because you're going to draw really cheaply some really high fidelity materials. But there's also times when you are going to want to have really high texel density in your final shader, or if you want to do something like you want your mask between the two materials to change over time, like you want to have some kind of procedural blend, you know, if you want to have some other input parameter, like if you had like rising water over like a wooden beam in like a harbor, you would want that to change as the height of the water changed, right? So that would be a brilliant example of where you would not want to use pre-baked BRDF parameters for that. Yeah. But if you would make an entire game with that, it would be prohibitive to be able to render it because it would just be too expensive. And I think, as with anything, sort of striking a balance between the two approaches is probably going to be the best way to do it.
Yeah, I think for cutscenes and stuff, the real-time layered approach is probably going to look better.
Yeah, depending on, I guess it depends on what's on your screen, right? Because for cutscenes, you can control what you're seeing and what you're rendering. And then you can do fancy tricks with, you know, scripting where you I don't know, compress stuff before the cutscene actually happens, depending on your approach, of course. But, you know, with, indeed, it seems like the procedural workflow seems to have some merit, but the I guess the computer power that we have right now isn't powerful enough to merit you know, giving away control over the textures to a parameter-based shader, I guess.
Well, I think it can be done. I mean, what I think we're going to see eventually is that in your even if you're using an offline baked workflow, something like, you know, Quixel or Substance Designer or something like that, like most of your kind of library of physically based materials, like a lot of that content is going to be generated procedurally anyway. So the only real difference we're talking about here is whether you're going to bake down a procedural material into a texture or render a procedural material at runtime. And there's not really that very much difference there in like the final result, apart from, you know, some resolution issues. Right. And I think I watched the talk that Ready at Dawn did at, I think, GDC this year actually, and I do believe that a lot of their actual like really big environment stuff, they actually are using real-time blended shaders on. I mean, they're not a lot of passes. They're only blending between at most sort of 2, maybe 3 materials, and they're using the baked approach for kind of stuff like props where you need to have a lot of sort of texture fidelity and that kind of thing. But I think with like the new generation consoles, like the Xbox One, the PS4, I think it's absolutely viable to use that as long as you're careful with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it probably, like you said, like with larger environment pieces where you want the really high pixel density because you want to tile these textures over larger surfaces, and where you're probably not blending between like 8 different types just for a building, right? That probably makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, because that way you're gonna retain like a really high pixel density, regardless of how big your textures actually are. Whereas if you do have something like a prop where there's like a lot of different materials you need to blend between, like Joe said, like 8, 10 different materials, like you obviously want to bake that down because it's gonna be too expensive otherwise.
Right. So I guess with that we're approaching 1 hour of our podcast now. So I think I guess it's a good point to kind of round off. So if there's anything you guys want to add to what's been said. I'm gonna round it off here. No?
Thanks for having me, and
Yeah.
keep it real.
All the time.
It's I think a lot of people have learned a lot of stuff. Looking at the comments in the on YouTube, it seems like a lot of people have their questions answered.
Cool.
We managed to go over all of the questions that have been user submitted, so that was good. I hope for our viewers or our listeners, depending on where you're watching or listening this, I hope you learned something from this. I want to thank everyone for watching and listening. I want to thank, of course, the guests, our panel of professionals for pitching in. So Andy, Joe, Lee, and Mark, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us on.
So I hope for everyone who's listened that you learned something. With that, we're going to round off. So see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye.
See ya.